The Inflation Reduction Act, the big beautiful bill, and what it means for you. This is Energy Matters.
And you're here with Dan and
Claire.
And we are your hosts and hopefully confidants when we talk about everything energy matters.
So Dan, what was the Inflation Reduction Act and why was it so unique, despite potentially its flaws?
And I guess the lead-in for everyone listening in and commenting is this is really about the worldviews that we had under the previous Biden administration and we have now under the Trump administration. So there's so many ways you could pull this apart, but I would say the simplest starting point for people who don't remember back what the U.S. was like, say 3 years ago when it was a very different place, is that the Inflation Reduction Act was a compromise bill put together in quite the surprise to the energy community. Few people kind of expected what would happen when essentially Senator Schumer from New York and Senator Manchin from West Virginia took a great deal of input and crafted something that was ultimately passed. And in the Inflation Reduction Act, there was $369 billion of direct federal money that was allocated largely to support electric vehicles, solar, wind, launching offshore wind, something where the U.S. was looking to catch up to China and Europe, investing in communities, and in particular, something that doesn't always get the attention, of that $369 billion of direct federal subsidies or direct federal spending, $60 billion, the single largest chunk, was actually for energy access, energy justice, energy diversity, and we will come back later in the episode to how dramatically different things are now. Now, when I say $369 billion were allocated, these were largely carrots. There were almost no sticks because of the very odd politics of a very, very liberal senator and a very conservative senator putting together the details. And when you look at the numbers, the amount of impact on the economy is dramatic. So the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, one of the largest spending bills in U.S. history, accelerating the clean energy transition, and the estimates of its total economic value go from something like $600 billion to $5 trillion, depending how you look at the various impacts. So it is a big thing in itself, and we will talk about how it is dramatically different from H.R. 1, the big, beautiful bill later. But let's start and stay with the Inflation Reduction Act for a little bit. So Claire, you're in the field.
Yep.
You are trying to make money and making green money in the process. How did the Inflation Reduction Act affect you directly?
So, I mean, as a capitalist and as a business person, the thing that was fascinating about the Inflation Reduction Act is that with $1.2 trillion in total of spending, the estimate was that another $3 to $4 trillion would be spent on climate reduction technologies by the capital markets. And what that meant was we can actually subsidize electric vehicles and put electric vehicles all over the country. We can spend more on solar to reduce what the grid congestion issues and transmission problems that are going on. It was a wonderful time to be in the market and a wonderful time to be hopeful about reducing the impacts of climate change in the United States.
And I think there's a lot of things that feed into that. So already the numbers of direct federal spending versus monies that had to be spent by companies or by municipalities to partner in makes these numbers all over the place. But it's a really interesting picture. There are lots and lots of flaws in the Inflation Reduction Act. Some of the more minor ones from my perspective, I would say hydrogen was subsidized too much.
Yep.
And there wasn't enough that was spent on the cleanup side or addressing the needs of fossil communities, be they coal mining communities in West Virginia or in Montana. Ironically, those were things that were in some Obama legislation that didn't make it through because largely to get this bill the number of votes it needed, it really needed to only accentuate the positive, not to highlight the negative. That said, what's happened across the world has been dramatic. So we now see places like Norway where last month 34, not 3,400, not 34,000, but 34 non-electric vehicles were sold nationwide.
What?
China is now well over 50% of all new vehicles in the world's largest vehicle market, all electric. While California was sort of the leader in the number of electric vehicles in the Western world, now the United Kingdom, England has surpassed that. So the Inflation Reduction Act, with all of its downsides, put the U.S. in such an interesting leadership position that we actually had other green energy leaders like President Macron of France saying, this is a horrible action. It's stealing our best clean energy leaders from Europe to go to the U.S. And my response to that was, isn't that actually what you want? You want a race to see who's going to make this go more. But it was such a change in how the U.S. approached things that it really caught a lot of our allies in Europe, allies in Japan and elsewhere off guard.
A breath of fresh air, right? Sort of like the race to the moon, really, is how can we solve our climate change problems collectively, right? Not only in Europe and not only in China, but also in the United States.
And I think it did some things that, built on what you just said, Claire, in ways that are interesting. So we had people like your former founding member and then the head of the loan guarantee program in the Biden administration, Jigar Shah, out there every day saying how great it would be to be replacing air conditioners, which are very energy intensive and polluting, with heat pumps, much more efficient technology. The debate around how are we investing in nuclear power, not just how we make solar available to rich homeowners, but how we make solar available to renters. All of these things had a place in the Inflation Reduction Act, and as we'll talk about in a bit, some of them are places where the current administration is not just trying to deny them, but actively tearing out pre-existing electric chargers for vehicles. So it has been a night and day difference between what we saw last administration to this one.
Yeah, and this might be a place where we might argue a little bit, but the J40, maybe you can tell us a little about the J40. I mean, what I saw as a person in the private sector, but who has also worked in the federal government, is that there were all sorts of organizations that were trying to get this Inflation Reduction Act money. So many different organizations that were hyper-local, that were trying to fix a hyper-local problem, but so much of that money was going to the back office, to the administration of those programs, and not as much of it as could have gone actually went to providing the solar for renters or the new HVAC systems for low-income communities.
So this, I think, is something we'll maybe even come back to in another episode, because when Claire says J40, and we'll always try to explain our acronyms, that's the Justice 40 effort. And what Justice 40 is, from my perspective as a Californian, was a Californian policy that didn't have a name that got named at the federal level. So in California, we've had a whole series of energy and climate laws that have passed, some of which seemed impossible, some not so difficult, and all are part of the landscape. And we'll come back to that. But what California set up was a cap and trade system, meaning a polluter pays system for greenhouse gas emissions in the state. And the way that was written was that 35% as a floor, not a ceiling, of the revenues from that effort would be then directed to be spent on low-income communities, communities of color, fence-line communities around polluting facilities. And so when then Vice President and candidate for President Biden came to California, talked to the governor, talked to the California Energy Commission, he and his team went back and said, well, I kind of like this Justice 35. They didn't come up with a good name in California. I'm going to call it Justice 40, and it's one of the executive orders, the 21 that he signed on his first full day in office. It established an Office of Workforce Engagement. in the Department of Energy. It established the programs that you mentioned that were supposed to give money back to communities, and some of which found it bureaucratically difficult. But it's really because if you go from Trump's administration 1, where none of this was on the table, to the Biden administration, where all of this got built back up, at the federal level, it's no surprise that you had to not just spend money, you had to build offices to spend money.
Right.
And I'm going to come back and ask you a question from the Obama administration.
Sure.
You were part of the team in the Loan Guarantee Office, and you needed to build from scratch some of the structures to do what you wanted to do. So there's a precedent for the need to spend not just in getting money out the door, but to rebuild the capacity to spend.
So when I was at the Department of Energy, I was in the senior executive service and ran a bunch of government funding. I wasn't a part of the loan guarantee program, but we were responsible for deploying about $11 billion of the stimulus package to go towards state energy programs, block grant programs, weatherization programs to serve low-income households. And we had to distribute all of that in basically 10 months without any waste, fraud, or abuse. So there definitely is a history of putting a lot of these, putting a whole bunch of federal money together at a very quick pace. I think the Inflation Reduction Act, though, had so much money and so many people had to create new organizations. And I see this on a local level and a larger level. You're a lot of that money goes towards executive directors, but then there's 25 executive directors in some specific area and not enough people spending the money on actually doing the work.
And it's funny you say that because as someone on the academic side, and who spends a lot of time working with governments in Europe. The German government, that's very famous for having essentially launched what was at the time the most successful subsidy program for solar power called feed-in tariffs, and working with some African governments that were engaged in efforts around so-called the net zero world, or reorienting their economies to be zero carbon, even if they're major fossil fuel states today like Nigeria. And so when I look at this from the academic perspective, I say, the Inflation Reduction Act was actually also trying to catch up on the infrastructure we need to be a clean energy economy, right, and trying to build the capacity that exists in countries overseas, China for sure, Germany for sure, England for sure. And one of the challenges is that might look like waste. But if you don't have offices and people skilled in doing these things,
right,
you actually, maybe you can get money out the door once, but you need to do program evaluation, things that sound boring. But ultimately, every program, good or bad, gets put under the microscope of, is the money being spent well or not? So I actually felt like even though the Inflation Reduction Act came up as a big surprise in a lot of ways,
yep,
it actually was a thoughtful combination of the things you need to do today, what we need, which is to start spending on clean energy, and down the line to have a capacity to think creatively about mid-course corrections we're going to need later on.
Sure. Yep, I agree with that. Absolutely. But unfortunately, a lot of that was stymied. And now we have the one big, beautiful bill to discuss.
And indeed we do. And so, we say this podcast is going to be about the facts, and we will always lead with the facts. But as someone who resigned my federal commission when Mr. Trump was elected the first time and felt we were making some painful missteps in the economy, I'm going to try to do my best to be a little bit impartial. But these are topics where these are fighting words for me, so it's going to be hard.
Oh, believe me, I've spent my career in the solar industry, and I think there's a lot to say about the big beautiful bill, right? But I think now that there are clear timelines for the investment tax credits and their decrease and phase out, so which is 2027 unless you begin construction or safe harbor before July of 2026. So now there's less ambiguity, and the message is clear, like, now's the time to secure your rooftops, queue for interconnection, move quickly, right? If you're interested in solar at all. And frankly, we aren't going to need the ITC, the investment tax credit, forever. We just needed a very clear phase out.
And this is somewhere I got to jump in, because here's a place where the lessons learned from California I thought were really interesting, because California was the first state to have large-scale subsidies in place for clean energy. Started with solar, then it went to electric vehicles. And as we'll talk about a number of times, the progress in making solar cheaper, in making electric vehicles cheaper, something we'll talk about later called the learning curve, or Moore's law for people in the computer world. These are things where California was able to get to a point where it removed the subsidy for solar.
Right.
There is still a subsidy available if you do storage and solar,
right.
But the subsidy was really to get storage cheap the way solar had already become cheap.
Right.
So these are interesting aspects of, for all of the ways in which academics like myself love to criticize federal action, what happened with the Inflation Reduction Act actually set us up in a way that, as you're highlighting the end of these subsidies, European governments, they'll set up a policy and you hope it's going to last for years and years. Here we did all this heavy lifting under Biden, and basically three years later, it's all being zeroed out.
It's all being zeroed out. Yep. I mean, I'm all for incentivizing batteries. So what you're referring to is the net energy metering rule, or NEM 3.0 in California, which I'm a big fan of, and should be, probably a good example of how we should be running a lot of the rest of the grid. But, essentially, the wheels are off. The 25D, which is the investment tax credit for residential, is gone as of the end of 2025. Commercial industrial is going to be okay, in the sense that if we can get stuff placed in service by 2027 or begin construction by July of 2026, we're going to be okay.
Well, when you say okay, again, I got to cut in, because my version of okay on the climate activist side and your version in the business world may be different, because what I see is that if you were already a company or a municipality that had committed to going green, you were going to do solar on public land, you were going to do a public-private partnership, then you're kind of already in the converted.
Correct.
And so those people are going to be rushing to get their projects done in the next year and a half, 2 years.
That's right.
But the insidious or the deeper message out there is that if you weren't sure about going green, despite the good economics that we'll talk about later, what this said is don't do anything, hold off, and don't become part of the wave that we're seeing around the world. Remember, 90% of all new energy projects worldwide, not just this year, but last year and the year before, have all been clean energy.
90% in the United States as well.
That's right.
Yep.
But now what I think we're going to see is anyone who was on the fence about becoming a player in this is now going to say, I'll just kind of hang back. And so what I worry about is not just the loss of projects that were in the so-called pipeline, but I worry about the overall change of philosophy where, we've now seen deals where Mr. Trump and his team have gone to Europe and have extracted deals where there's going to be a huge purchase of U.S. exported gas, investments that are now going to be required in Japan to put not the $200 billion they've been investing in the U.S. economy, but $600 billion, and a lot of that into fossil projects. So I see not just financial damage, but mindset damage coming out of what we're
Mindset
seeing
damage,
here.
absolutely, right? So at Sunrock, what we do is we finance power purchase agreements for commercial industrial customers. And a lot of the off-takers that were considering it are saying, I don't really understand what NPR is telling me right now, or Fox News. I'm just going to hold back and wait and see, right? Our partners, our EPC partners, our construction folks are saying, well, gosh, I have to get everything installed as quickly as I possibly can, and I'm going to have to switch from residential to commercial. So I'm going to have to figure that out. What I mean by being okay is at least we know what the rules are now, and the solar industry will accommodate towards them. So 2019 versus today, solar today without the federal tax credit is better than solar was in somewhere between 2016 and 2019 with the solar tax credit. We don't need the tax credits anymore. They're going to go down over time. But certainly continuing with the federal tax credit would have been delightful because it would have subsidized solar longer and made everybody much more efficient.
But see, I'm not even sure we need to think of it that way. And I agree with you. But with the cost of solar coming down, what we're finding is that energy is a system, and we have this thing called nighttime. So during nighttime, there's no solar production. So what you really want to be doing as you evolve and grow out of your infancy into your teenage years is you don't just build solar and wind, you build those
Solar
with
plus storage. Exactly right.
And
one of the
world.
biggest winners of the big, beautiful bill is energy storage, which will benefit from the full ITC until 2032.
And what's funny is that behind the scenes, a number of Republican members of the House that voted against the Inflation Reduction Act actually in their re-election this past year campaigned on its benefits. And some of them really fought behind the scenes to get storage to be maintained because they see that as a business that can be in their district. So there are some interesting
where you're going to
complications.
manufacture storage in
Absolutely.
their district.
Right.
Though it's been fascinating because a lot of these Republican senators have had battery storage or solar manufacturing facilities put in their districts, but they voted for the one big beautiful bill.
Yep.
It's very interesting. One statistic I love is that adding capacity from solar plus storage in Texas this year has reduced the chance of rolling blackouts from 12% to 0.3%, according to ERCOT, which is the state's grid operator. That's a huge percentage. Nobody ever really thinks about Texas as being a huge renewable resource, but 30% of Texas's energy comes from renewable resources.
Texas now is number one, and you can say whether it's because they have a climate that's amenable to it or they have a lot of land, or because despite protests about what happened when Texas had its freeze out in the winter, they actually learned that the wind turbines, the solar stayed on, whereas the gas plants went off. And so Texas has absolutely become a massive clean energy leader. And it's interesting to see, as you pull away the rhetoric, what I keep finding again and again is that now that clean energy is cheaper than fossil energy,
Yep.
and it's cheaper on many metrics. And my favorite kind of, short version of that is in much of the world, it's now cheaper to build a new clean energy power plant than to just operate an existing fossil plant.
Isn't that great?
That's an amazing number.
There's great statistics, which we'll put on our website, energymatters.world, about from the levelized cost of energy from Lazard. And that's sort of the industry standard. But you can see hands down solar makes way more sense than natural gas and nuclear, than really anything, both from a cost perspective and from a timing perspective. So one of the things that we're seeing in the industry is that U.S. power consumption is rising dramatically, driven by AI, driven by data centers and electric vehicles. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, forecast 5-year peak demand growth has increased by a factor of 5 compared to 2022, which is crazy. That's because of data center power consumption is going up year on year by 10%. Forecasted growth in peak demand over the next year, next 5 years is going up astronomically. And we have an aging grid infrastructure, which has created massive bottlenecks in the utility scale generation. So if you're a solar developer or a wind developer, really any developer, the years spent in the interconnection queue could be 5 years or more, depending on the utility that you're in. And so where are we going to get all this energy from? I mean, it makes perfect sense to do distributed energy, solar plus storage particularly, because you generate your energy where you use it. But where are we going to get this energy from if it's not going to be from solar plus storage?
So it's interesting because as a researcher on clean energy, and I would say as a proponent of clean energy, to my view, the added demand, this is a exciting bring it on moment. It is true that if you have an electric vehicle at your home, when your electric vehicle is at maximum speed, like you floored it and you floor your house, meaning you turn on every light, everything, every washer, dryer, your car is using 3 to 4 times as much energy as your house is. So that's a lot of energy, but clean energy is now so inexpensive. And if the rules, many of those set up in the Inflation Reduction Act, were to have been followed out, installing clean energy has gotten easier and easier. And so
well, and less expensive.
Well, that's what I mean by easier and
Yeah.
easier. There's a lot of ways to do it. And so the version of this story, the kind of the debate when Angela Merkel was the chancellor of Germany, she liked to say that in Germany, if you follow our regulations, which is of course on the web, to do what's called the feed-in tariff, meaning you qualify and you install solar generally, but it was solar or wind on your home or your business or your industry, the form you fill out is literally like one piece of paper. Whereas when the U.S. got started in the field, and you know at SunEdison, it was far more than one piece of paper. And so streamlining all of these non-hardware costs, we call them the balance of systems costs, was one of the things that has brought the prices down for clean energy. And so much so that we are now seeing in the parts of the U.S. West, not just rooftop solar, but trailer parks and places that are parking garages are putting solar on top. And they're finding that the business case for solar, if the market is thoughtfully set up, meant it was easier and easier. And so California has now exported clean energy to its neighboring states for 110 days in a row. And California is the fourth largest economy on the planet. And so it's not like some small case. I don't want to say anything derogatory about Costa Rica, which I love. They do clean energy all the time from hydro, but they're small.
Right.
California's a big dog, and they can now be exporting clean energy when the rules permit.
But so what you're saying, though, Dan, is that despite the fact that the one big, beautiful bill is trying to improve the economics for fossil fuels and make it worse for clean energy is still going to prevail.
Well, I hope it is. We'll talk about in the next couple episodes the real barriers. And I guess the last thing that needs to be on the table, because we're going to come back to these bills later in the series, is that while the big, beautiful bill, which I just call HR1, House Bill number 1, because I can't stand that term, is that something else is happening at the same time, and it's the interaction of this HR1 and this new thing, and that's called the effort by the current administration's leader of the Environmental Protection Agency to kill a 2009 finding called the endangerment finding. And almost all of climate legislation in the United States is based around this endangerment finding. And that says that hurting the climate is bad for people, which sounds pretty simple. Hurting the climate is bad for crops. It's bad for biodiversity. It's bad for poor people. It's bad for women. It's bad for the economy. Lee Zeldin, the current head of the U.S. EPA, is now leading the effort to repeal that endangerment finding. And if you get the negative aspects of HR1 and you get a finding that we don't care about the climate, which in my language is we don't care about our own children,
obviously,
then you have a package of a bill and a policy change at the Environmental Protection Agency that together really will scare us. And we'll come back to this, but it's these two things together that make me even more worried about the anti-environmental and really anti-economic direction that we seem to be going.
Very anti-economic, yeah. I mean, I think the thing that's scary to me, and as I think about my kids and hopefully grandkids at some point in time, is, we don't have solutions. And so if we're going to try to focus on, fossil fuels, great, but clean energy and particularly solar plus storage is going to have to be the solution. And if we continue to make it harder to do that with our interconnection queues, with our permits, with, all of the things that we're trying to do to make it harder, what's going to end up happening is there's just going to be more blackouts and brownouts. That's what's going to happen. We already have seen in the solar industry 250,000 jobs are going to be lost just in the residential space, and utility rates are going to go up by 20+% all across the country. That is an absolute fact, right? And so we're going to see with the big, beautiful bill, they're going to do their darndest to try to support fossil fuels. But the fact of the matter is there will be more brownouts and blackouts. And that is going to, just by default, cause people to buy batteries.
Right. And we have put some readings on the website so that you can go to track some of these issues if you go to energymatters.world. One of the things that I think Claire and I might show some differences in opinion later on, but we'll come back to are some of the subsidies that exist for investing in fossil fuels in the U.S. and other countries, and the degree to which, no matter what your politics is, with the current state of energy generation, the flexibility, the speed, the low cost of renewables, to my mind, HR1, the big blanking bill, is to my mind a version of economic suicide. It is moving against the direction that not only the science is taking us, but the economic opportunities are taking us. And that's why, again, no matter how you voted, to my mind, we are seeing a sad giveaway of leadership that the U.S. was just starting to really lean into.
It's such a disappointment. Yeah, Max Boot of the Washington Post had a really good article in which he said, we are witnessing the suicide of a superpower. And I really think that that's true.
It's a hard place to end this episode. We'll be more upbeat when we talk about startups and Silicon Valley culture and things, but hope you've enjoyed so far. And again, hope you give us feedback at info@energymatters.world, or just go to the website, download the episodes, take a look at the direction that this podcast series is going. And this is Dan.
And this is Claire. Thank you so much for listening.